we're going to be discussing that fall under the heading America, Israel, and the Arab World Towards Reconciliation are complex, emotional, not always well presented, not always presented in a balanced manner. And I think we're lucky to have today a panel of extraordinary individuals, Ambassador Abdurrahman, Rabbi Boteach, Professor Dershowitz, Mr. Ibish. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for being here, and for taking the time to flesh out these issues and be part of an open debate about that topic with us today. We're also privileged to have our own Professor Michael Watkins as our moderator today. And without further ado, I'll leave the floor to him to introduce our guest and get this debate started. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Hisham, and welcome everyone to this evening's events. I'd like to just quickly go over some goals and ground rules, if you will, for tonight's event, say a couple of context-setting comments, and then really get into the introduction of our panelists and the event proper. I want to start by saying that the overriding goal this evening is obviously an educational one. I mean, that's what we're all here for, and that's why I personally thought that this event was so important. I think we've left behind the days when the Harvard Business School can afford to be insulated from the very difficult and challenging political events and issues of the day. At the same time, we have a responsibility as a community to address those issues and events in as balanced and open a manner as possible in order to be consistent with our broader educational objectives. In highlighting education as the overwhelming or overriding objective for this evening, I want to commend the efforts of the sponsors of this event, the Jewish Students Association and the Middle East and North Africa Club. I think their efforts here are consistent with the best traditions of the school. And I very much hope that the organizing effort they have undertaken will come to serve as a standard for how events of this kind should be conducted within this community. I especially want to thank and recognize Arash Farron and Hisham, and I'm going to fracture your name, Hisham, I'm sorry for this, El-Khazindar, for their efforts. This evening is a direct result of Arash's initiative to organize an event here at HBS on the conflict in the Middle East. And to his credit, he saw and recognized the need early on for this to be an event that brought a balanced set of viewpoints to the issues rather than a single set of viewpoints. And I therefore hope you'll just join me briefly in thanking Arash for his leadership on this issue. Thanks to Hisham, I think he also recognized the importance of making this event a balanced exposition of views, and so agreed to jointly sponsor it and to help recruit strong representatives for the panel. So again, please join me in thanking Hisham for his efforts. The ground rules for this evening have been worked out in negotiations that I came to feel sometimes rivaled those in the Middle East in their complexity and difficulty. This is to say that, we have worked out, I think, a very fair and balanced way of engaging in dialogue tonight, one that's been agreed to by the sponsors and by the panelists. After introducing the panelists, we'll begin with 7-minute opening statements from each of the panelists. The order of these statements, and in fact the order of everything that's going to happen tonight, has been worked out in advance. Following those opening statements, each of the panelists will then have 3 additional minutes to respond to the comments or augment their views as they see fit. We're then going to engage in 2 short debates over propositions about this conflict. I've developed the propositions for this segment. I'm the only one that knows what they are at this point, and we're going to sort of test the nimbleness of our panel on this particular issue. We'll then have 15 or so minutes for members of the audience, that's you, to ask some questions of the panelists. In doing this, I'd ask you to line up behind one of the 2 microphones that we've set up in the aisleways. Not now, but to do it as we get closer to that, out the door and through and out into Aldrich, right? A couple of points about this period. You should really limit yourself to short, focused questions and not statements of position or argument. The panelists are only going to respond to questions from people at the microphones. We ask you very strongly to refrain from making comments from your chairs, however strongly you may be feeling about what's being said by the panelists. The panelists can and will ably represent the range of views on this situation. They do not need or want your help on this. And I should say with some seriousness, interference, unsolicited interference is really simply an attack on the process of open dialogue in events like this. And I just really want to profoundly discourage you from doing that. Given the limited time, we'll almost certainly not have time to take everybody's question, and we want to apologize in advance to those who are disappointed. Following the audience portion of this, the panelists will make 5-minute closing statements, and then Arash is going to make some final comments to conclude the event. As to the substance, there's some things I'd like you to think about as you're listening to the panelists. I think that this conflict is as deep and bitter as one can possibly imagine a conflict to be. Its historical roots are deep. The grievance on the part of people on both sides, or all sides, in fact, are profound. I don't expect we're going to solve this problem tonight. I don't even expect the panel is going to change your minds about the issues if you feel strongly about them. But I do invite you to listen to the best of your abilities to what these people have to say. I also invite you to try and put it in a broader context of what makes conflicts like these very difficult to solve. I would point to things like partisan perceptions, right? The tendency of people to see reality through the lens of their partisanship. I would point to things like fractured political systems and systemic leadership weaknesses that give power to the extremes in many cases. And I would point to the profound psychological scars that have been endured by both sides and their consequent competition, really directed at anyone outside the conflict, to have you believe that theirs is the right side on these sets of issues. With no further ado, I want to move on and introduce quickly our panelists. We have a wonderful panel this evening, I have to tell you. I'm going to just introduce them in alphabetical order. I'll start with Hassan Abdulrahman, the Chief Representative of the Palestinian Liberation Organization in the United States. Born in Ramallah, Mr. Abdulrahman attended the University of Jordan, the University of Damascus in Syria, before earning his master's degree from the University of Puerto Rico in planning and public administration. He started his PhD studies at the City University of New York in 1974, earlier than that, but left in 1974 to become the Director of Information at the PLO office in New York. He subsequently became Deputy Chief of Mission for the PLO to the United Nations, transferred to Washington and served as Director of the PLO Information Office, joined the Palestinian negotiating team to the Madrid Peace Conference and has participated in all subsequent negotiations. In 1992, he was named Chief Representative of the PLO in Ottawa, and in 1994, after the signing of the Oslo Accords, he took up his current post as Chief PLO Representative of the United States. Shmuley Botaek, forgive me, I'm doing the best I can. Thank you. It's good to hear. Is a nationally syndicated host on Talk America Radio Network. After attending rabbinical colleges in Florida and California, Rabbi Botaek studied for 3 years in Israel. At the age of 22, he went to Oxford University as a rabbi. While there, he founded the L'Chaim Society, an organization of Oxford students dedicated to making Judaism accessible to everyone and to fostering dialogue on world issues. It's an immensely successful organization. His subsequent evolution has taken him towards a role as a social commentator and an advocate for traditional Jewish values in the broader community. In the process, he has taken courageous positions on issues of sexuality and Gentile-Jewish relations. He is the author of 13 books, including the international bestsellers Kosher Sex, Dating Secrets of the Ten Commandments, and my personal favorite, Kosher Adultery. Which turns out to be a book about fidelity, which is really a pretty interesting thing. Let's see now. He was a finalist. His book Why I Can't Fall in Love was a finalist for the 2002 Books for a Better Life Award, and In May, he will publish Judaism for Everyone, Renewing Your Life Through the Vibrant Lessons of the Jewish Faith. I think Rabbi Botev brings a profound understanding and sympathy for the relational dimensions and the impacts on the communities of these sorts of issues. And we're very, very, very pleased to have him here. Alan Dershowitz is the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School, a distinguished graduate of Brooklyn College and Yale Law School. He is a leading scholar in civil liberties law and criminal law. He is the author of 14 books, the most recent of which you appear to have Rabbi Botev by one book at this point, Professor Dershowitz. His most recent book, Why Terrorism Works, Understanding the Threat, Responding to the Challenge, was published just this year. In it, he raises provocative questions about civil liberties in the age of terrorism. He's published more than 100 articles, been broadly syndicated. He's been described by Newsweek as one of the nation's most distinguished defenders of individual rights, and by Time magazine as the top lawyer of last resort in the country. We have to talk, by the way. I've been a bad boy. Hussein Ibish is the communications director for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, the largest Arab American membership organization. Dr. Ibish earned his PhD in comparative literature from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, for which we will, of course, forgive him. He is the editor and principal author of American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee's last 2 reports on hate crimes and discrimination against Arab Americans, the most recent dealing with the upsurge in such attacks since 9/11. He is the author of At the Constitution's Edge, Arab Americans and Civil Liberties in the United States, in the collection States of Confinement, and Anti-Arab Bias in American Policy and Discourse in the book Race in the 21st Century America. He's also the co-author of The Palestinian Right of Return and The Media and the New Intifada. Dr. Ibish also serves as the Vice President of the National Coalition to Protect Political Freedom. Please join me in welcoming our panel. All right. With no further ado, we will push on to the initial discussions by the participants, beginning 7 minutes to you, Professor Dershowitz.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
This is yours. Slide.
Yes. Ramadan Mubarak, Hanukkah Sameach, and Happy Thanksgiving. I think I've gotten all the bases covered. For those of us who support a two-state solution to the current Mideast crisis, and I believe that includes most of us in this room tonight, the beginning point, I think, of any serious discussion has to be the United Nations decision, Resolution 181, to partition what is now Israel and the Palestinian Authority into a Jewish state and a Palestinian Arab state. That was the Palestinian mandate that was given to England prior to that, and that was the partition that was proposed by the United Nations, indeed enacted by the United Nations. The United Nations voted to reward the Palestinians with a state, even though the Palestinian leadership had sided with Hitler during the Second World War and had directly supported the Holocaust against the Jews, and even though there already was one state with a majority Palestinian population, the state of Jordan, which had previously been carved out of the Palestinian mandate. Now, despite the fact that the proposed Jewish state was, as you can see, a small fraction of what had been promised by the Balfour Declaration and seemed indefensible against enemy attacks, particularly Jerusalem, the Jewish Agency accepted the partition and called the state of Israel into existence. Had the Palestinians done the same, and this is the crucial point, had the Palestinians declared a Palestinian state at that point, which the United Nations had authorized them to do, tens of thousands of lives would have been saved, and the two-state solution we now all strive for would have been a reality. But instead, the combined Arab armies of the neighboring states and the Palestinian guerrillas waged an illegal, aggressive war against the new Jewish state. And I don't think anybody can doubt that it was illegal and an aggressive war. Fighter planes bombed Israeli population centers, including Tel Aviv. Israel lost 1% of its population in defending itself against an aggressive war by 7 attacking armies. In the process, the Jewish state did capture more territory than the United Nations had allotted it, and between 430 and 700,000 Arabs became refugees. An equivalent number of Jews became refugees from Arab lands when they were forced to leave Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, and other Arab countries. The armistice lines of 1949 constituted the de facto borders of Israel until 1967, when once again the combined Arab armies of Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and the Palestinians waged an aggressive war against Israel, first by illegally closing the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, and then after Israel destroyed the Egyptian Air Force by shelling Israeli population centers, including Jerusalem, Netanya, and the suburbs of Tel Aviv. Now, the key point to keep in mind is that the object of these illegal wars of aggression against Israel was not to achieve a Palestinian state, nor was that the object of Palestinian terrorism that had begun in the 1920s and had persisted after the 1948 war, killing thousands of civilians. Between 1947 and 1967, Palestinians could have achieved statehood without any opposition from Israel. The object of these aggressive wars was, and I don't think we'll see any denial of that tonight, to destroy the Jewish state of Israel and to impose a one-state solution on the area, that state being an Arab Muslim state in all of Palestine, including Israel. And again in the year 2000, the Palestinians could have had a state on approximately 95% of the territories captured in the 1967 war, with its capital in Jerusalem, with compensation for refugees, and with an end to Israeli settlements on most Palestinian lands. Again, it responded with the targeting of Israeli civilians. As the late Abba Eban, who was a great advocate of peace and a strong supporter of the two-state solution, once put it, the Palestinian leadership have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They can't seem to take yes for an answer. For 3/4 of a century, the Arab nations have waged aggressive war against the Jewish people, first in order to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state and then to destroy the Jewish state. They have used the Palestinians, first the refugee problem and then Palestinian statehood, as a justification for their real goal, namely the end of Jewish statehood. A recent poll conducted by Palestinians in the Palestinian Authority showed that almost 90% of Palestinians wish to see terrorism increase and persist until all of Palestine, including Israel, is liberated. This has been, and in the view of most Palestinians, continues to be a war not for Palestinian statehood alongside a Jewish state, but for an end to the Jewish state. It has also been a war, and this is very important, by Arab nations dedicated to aggression against civilians on the one hand, and the Jewish people determined to protect its civilian population by taking defensive action directed against military targets on the other hand, although Israel has sometimes overreacted. The 73-year war, in which one side has consistently, illegally, and aggressively targeted civilians, and the other side has consistently, lawfully, and defensively responded by attacking military targets, began in 1929 with the well-planned and carefully coordinated massacre of 67 Jewish children, women, and old people, and other unarmed civilians resident in the biblical city of Hebron, in which Jews had lived peacefully and continuously from time immemorial. These were not Zionists. These were simply Jews. Between 1929 and 1947, there were repeated attacks against Jewish civilians, including the bombing of Tel Aviv and the well-coordinated ambush of the Hadassah Medical Center, massacring 78 doctors, nurses, and professors. The 67 war was again clearly a war directed by all the Arab armies against Israeli civilian population centers. Syrian artillery and MiGs opened fire on Israeli towns, kibbutzim and moshavim. Jordan rained 6,000 shells down on western Jerusalem. I could go on and on and on. The important point is that in all of these wars, Israel has never once bombed an Arab city. It has never once dropped a bomb on an Arab population center. It has never once targeted a single Arab civilian. To be sure, Arab civilians have been killed in the process of military actions. But the distinction between the consistent 75-year targeting of civilians by the Arab nations and Israel's attempt to reduce civilian populations is quite remarkable. To be sure, civilians have died. But more civilians were killed by Jordan in 1 month, more Palestinians, September 1970, than Israel has killed in 73 years of combat started by the Palestinians. The important point is that this has been a war between civilians and the military. My time is now up, but when I have an opportunity to respond and an opportunity to finish my comments, we will see how this historical background is essential to understanding the ongoing dispute today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dershowitz. We're now going to turn to Mr. Abdul Rahman for 7 minutes. And sir, you can decide to stand up here. You can do it from the table. It's entirely up to you.
I'll stand.
Very good.
Well, I'm very grateful for the invitation to be here today. I must say from the outset that I'm so disappointed with what I heard from Mr. Dershowitz. Not because it is totally inaccurate, what he said, but the tone in which he made his presentation. I can show you, he said that Israel never attacked an Arab city. Israel attacked the city of Beirut and killed 17,500 people. Go to any internet site. This happened in my lifetime, Mr. Dershowitz, not last century or the century before. Today, I want you to look at the Washington Post and the New York Times and see that Israeli army in the city of Jenin yesterday killed 4 people walking in the street. One of them is a 15-year-old boy. Unless Mr. Dershowitz believes that the 370 Palestinian children under the age of 15 that were killed by the Israeli army were combatants. And unless Mr. Dershowitz believes that Muhammad Durra, who was 7 years old, killed in the lab of his father, was a combatant. Mr. Dershowitz, I assure you that 90% of the Israeli people will not repeat the distortions that you repeated here today because they will be ashamed to make such distortions. I am really very disappointed. I came here looking forward for a sort of discussion over reconciliation. And what I heard here tonight is a repetition of the worst kind of propaganda that the most and the worst Israeli propagandists even have shame to say. Mr. Dershowitz, at the beginning of this century, there were 3% of the people of Palestine of the Jewish faith, and they were Palestinians. In less than 50 years, there were 750,000 Jews who immigrated into Palestine. I myself, 4 years older than the State of Israel. There were 1 million Jewish Russians who immigrated to Israel only last year. And there are 4 million Palestinian refugees who are living outside of their country. How can you morally justify the bringing into Palestine hundreds of thousands of Jews from Europe, from Russia, from Argentina, from Brooklyn, New York, into Palestine while Palestinians are lavishing in refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere? Today, the Palestinian people are the only people in the world who live under foreign military occupation, denied their very basic political and human rights. Every single Palestinian today living in the land of Palestine is living under foreign military occupation, namely the Israeli military, or in exile as a refugee. How can you morally, and you are a man of law, a lawyer, justify this atrocity? How can you justify, Mr. Dershowitz, that today, in the year 2002, people are denied their very basic political and human rights. I did not want to get into that. I came here today to speak about reconciliation, the two-state solution. I am, and my generation of Palestinians, were willing to concede 80% of our country, 80% of what was the country of our forefathers and fathers and my own country, and recognize the state of Israel in exchange for Israel accepting our right to live on 22%, which is the West Bank and Gaza. I came here to speak tonight of reconciliation, not of propaganda that amounts to incitement, that has no validity. Even the least educated people in the world will not take it as serious. Israelis will not take it as serious. Remember what Barak used to say. He said, if I were a Palestinian, I will join a Palestinian organization to fight for our freedom. How can you or anyone else expect the Palestinians to live under the Israeli military occupation? There are Israeli tanks and Israeli soldiers that are ruling the lives of the Palestinians. The city of Nablus, for 120 days, is under curfew. 39 Palestinian children were born on checkpoints, Mr. Dershowitz. Is that the kind of life that you want the Palestinian people to tolerate? And is that the kind of atrocity that someone like you, teaches law at Harvard Law School, is advocating? I'm really disappointed. Thank you very much.
Right. If I could ask Rabbi Bertoik to come to the podium, please.
With 7 minutes, I'll get straight to the point. February 25th, 1994 was a Jewish holiday like today. Today's the 5th night of Hanukkah. It wasn't that joyous, though, even though it should have been. It was called Purim. Because on that day, an Israeli settler in Hebron named Baruch Goldstein decided to go into a house of God, a mosque, and dropping grenades and emptying magazine after magazine of an M16, mowed down 29 Palestinian worshippers whose crime was to pray before the God of Abraham. And when I awoke to the news on the BBC, I was the rabbi at Oxford University at the time, I waited to see how the Jewish world would respond to this fundamental challenge. You see, there were Arabs chanting death to the Jews outside one of the synagogues the night before in Hebron. Would they use that as an excuse for what he did? You also see that he was a doctor who treated many of his own friends who were stab victims. Would they say it was wrong, but we have to look at the causes of his terror? To the credit of the world Jewish community in general and the state of Israel in particular, Baruch Goldstein was dismissed as an abomination to the Israeli people and to Judaism, although he wore a yarmulke like I do, although he had a beard like I had. Some of his crazy followers built a shrine to him. It was outlawed by the state of Israel. No one called him a martyr, the way Yasser Arafat called Yichya Ayash, the engineer, a martyr. No Israeli prime minister said, like Yasser Arafat after the Passover massacre, on the 30th of March 2002, oh God, give me martyrdom like this. We are all potential martyrs. No wife of an Israeli prime minister said, like Suwa Arafat, would it that I had a son, so he too could blow himself up and kill innocent people. Baruch Goldstein was a murderer. Until today, the Israeli army, there's a law saying that you cannot come and give homage to him as a martyr of the Jewish people. It's interesting that Ambassador Rahman, we could have met as brothers, but with that kind of attack against Israel, you forgot military occupation. If the United States had Afghanistan right where Canada is, and every day there were suicide bombers blowing up civilians in New York, in Boston, in Detroit, do you want to tell me the United States military wouldn't be in there right now trying to stop it? And would any of us vote for a president that didn't go and try to stop it? We crossed the world to Afghanistan and brought about regime change. And our soldiers are still there. Our soldiers are still there. Anyone here protesting against that? What are American soldiers doing in Afghanistan? We're going to wait until the Taliban is cleaned up, because we're not going to sit in our buildings and wait to die. We did nothing to deserve to die. Ladies and gentlemen, Islam was once a great world religion. To Pat Robertson, who says that George W. Bush was not elected as the theologian-in-chief. We've been misled about violence in the Quran. I want to remind him that when the Crusaders, Christian Crusaders, crossed Europe to recapture the Holy Sepulchre, they slaughtered every last Turk they found in Jerusalem and every last Jew. And it was the greatest Muslim leader of all time, Sultan Saladin of Egypt, who reconquered it in 1187. And the first thing he did was allow all the Christian defenders to redeem themselves, even those who were poor and didn't have money. And he allowed the warriors to go to Tyre, even though he knew he would have to fight them again. And he thereby forever established the idea of chivalry. He taught chivalry to medieval Christian knights. And in 1190, he invited the Jews back to inhabit Jerusalem. For those who say that Islam is not educated, or that Islam is backward, because the United Nations Human Development Report of 2002 showed that the Arabs have a standard of living just above sub-Saharan Africa, and that the Arab women, 50% in the world, are illiterate, can't read and write. I want to remind them that the Muslims, we only have Plato, Socrates, Aristotle today, because of great Muslim scholars who translated them, and the Abbasid dynasty. To those who say that Islam mistreats women, I want to remind them that in India, in the 14th century, laws were passed protecting the rights of women before this was ever known in Europe. Where is that great religion today? You can say what you will about Israel, but be careful of what you wish for. Because if the Arabs do destroy Israel, and they're doing a very good job, because even Newsweek magazine did a cover story asking, will there be an Israel in 50 years' time? You take Israel out of the equation. Is that going to remove Mubarak in Egypt, who just threw a human rights activist into prison for 7 years because he criticized the regime? If Israel's destroyed, is that going to change the House of Saud, who allowed 15 young girls to burn to death in a school because they weren't wearing the hijab as they ran from the flames? Is that going to change that Aghajari in Iran, who lost a leg in the Iran-Iraq war, was just sentenced to death for simply saying we need not follow every last word of the mullahs? Is that going to change that Yasser Arafat is accused by Hussein, his own very finance controller, of stealing $8 million a month for the Palestinian Authority, and now he's in exile in London? The Israeli military says he's worth $1.3 billion. You take Israel out of the equation, is any of that going to change? I'm in Boston on a festival of Jewish liberty, and I ask all of you, because when I come here I'm inspired, where is the Islamic Patrick Henry today? We Americans rebelled against George III when he taxed our tea, for goodness sake. You compare George III, who's referred to in our most precious document, the Declaration of Independence, as a tyrant. You compare him to Saddam Hussein, and he's Mother Teresa. The question is not should the United States invade Iraq. It's why do Westerners have to liberate Muslims who within the 60 years of the death of the Prophet had conquered 40% of the civilized world? What happened to Muslims who were once so noble and so great? How could it be that the only place in the Middle East where Arabs vote is Israel? How could it be that the only place they have guaranteed judicial rights is the Israeli Supreme Court? How could it be that the only place where women are given absolute equal rights, Arab women, in Israel, where they don't have to move to the back of the bus the way they do in Saudi Arabia, or get arrested for riding a bicycle or driving a car, or having to get permission from the government in Saudi Arabia to marry a non-Saudi? I know I have to finish, but be careful what you wish for, because if Israel's destroyed and the Arabs have the upper hand, we have the toughest general in power right now, Sharon. Even he can't protect his citizens anymore. And the only democracy in the Middle East is gone. And that what the Arabs have to look forward to under Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority is yet another tyranny.
Dr. Erbish, would you join us at the podium?
Sure.
Well,
I think very predictably thus far tonight, we've been treated to, or one might even say subjected to, a very large amount of emotion and a very large amount of highly debatable and tendentious history, all of which is designed to mystify. Right? That's what usually happens when talking about this issue, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And Israelis do it, Palestinians do it, everybody does it, right? Everybody mystifies, everybody tries to invoke a tendentious reading of history, everybody tries to use their ideology, their religion, etc., to justify the unjustifiable, and to present, as I think in particular Mr. Dershowitz also to some extent, Rabbi Boteach, a kind of a vision of this conflict that essentially explains it by implying that there are two kinds of people in the world, good people and bad people. And one of these parties is basically good people, and one of these parties is basically possessed of badness. And I think that if you want to reject and move beyond that sort of second-grade version of history and reality, and you want to move beyond the notion that things are explicable because of badness, you might start looking at the structural reasons for why there's a conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, right? And to do that, I think, we don't need recourse to tendentious history. In fact, we don't need recourse to history, although history is very relevant. We can look at the situation as it exists today, and honestly, and that will be sufficient to identify why there's a conflict, and also to identify modalities for creating peace and, as the title of this program suggests, reconciliation. Right? What is the circumstance that appertains in this country? This country, which is west of the Jordan River and east of the Mediterranean. You could call it Eretz Israel, you could call it Palestine, you could call it Israel/Palestine, and you can call it anything you want to. For the past 35 years, it has been a single geographical, historical entity ruled by a single sovereign, and in fact it was so before, earlier in the century. In fact, for most of the past 80 years, it's been a single geographical unit ruled by a single sovereign, first the British, and then in the last 35 years the Israelis. And the border between the occupied territories and Israel is largely a fictional convenience, at least insofar as the Israeli government behaves, because the Israeli government, for its own purposes, treats the entire thing as if it were the state of Israel. Right? Now, in this country, there are exactly equal numbers, according to Israeli demographers, exactly equal numbers of two national groups, right? 4.7 million Jewish Israelis and 4.7 million Palestinian Muslims and Christians. However, all of the political power in this country is in the hands of one of those two groups, the Jewish Israelis. The big majority of the second group, the Palestinians, the 3.5 million who live in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip, right? Not the 1 million who are 1.2 million who are citizens of Israel, but the big majority who live in the occupied territories, are not citizens of the state that rules them or any other state. These are the biggest group of non-citizens in the entire world. So they're not a minority being subjected to run-of-the-mill discrimination that exists in every country. They are utterly and completely disenfranchised, right? And every single aspect of daily life, from the moment you wake up until the moment you go to sleep at night, in the occupied territories is determined by whether you are a Jewish Israeli settler or soldier, or whether you are a Palestinian Muslim or Christian living under Israeli military occupation. Where you can live, what roads you can drive on, what law you live under, whether you're a citizen of the state that rules you. Can you be armed for self-defense? Will you be routinely tortured if arrested by the military? How much water are you going to get access to? What kind of education are your children going to get? Can you travel freely? On and on. I'm not going to bore you to death. All of this, radically different, depending on your ethnicity. This is the most extraordinary system of ethnic discrimination anywhere in the world today. Right? Now, I submit to you that anywhere in the world you have equal numbers of people in the same country, and all the political power is held by one group, and the big majority of the second group is not only discriminated against, but disenfranchised non-citizens, right? You're going to have a conflict. Nobody is going to agree to accept this. People are going to rebel, especially after decades with no end in sight. This is basically what has happened twice in the first Intifada, and now again, people are rebelling because they feel that they need to do that to get their basic rights. Now, what I'm trying to suggest to you is that for peace to exist and for reconciliation to occur, there has to be a modicum of equality between masters and slaves, between the dominant and subordinated, between citizens and non-citizens. There cannot be reconciliation. What reconciliation is there between masters and slaves? There can only be conflict. I think it's clear. There are only three options here. A single democratic state, which corresponds to all known human values except for the value of peace, because it won't be a Jewish state, because at least half Arab now. And I think that trying to force Israelis into this sentences us to a long and bitter conflict that can be avoided. Two states, right? Is the obvious solution. Everybody in the world agrees with this. The US, the UN Security Council, it's the official goal and the real goal of the Palestinian National Movement. And so the only group of people in the world who stand opposed to it is the Israeli government. In fact, they just repudiated the UN ambassador Yehuda Lankri for speaking out in favor of two states, and Sharon and Netanyahu said, no way, you don't have any authority. So that's not our policy at all. You know, the only force that prevents this solution from coming about is the Israeli army, which stands between the Palestinians and their national liberation and their freedom. Why? Because the Israeli government and forces inside Israel want to retain the land. That's why they keep building settlements. Every day they build settlements. If it was just like Afghanistan, if it was a security measure, they wouldn't be building settlements all over the place to consolidate their rule. Now, what I want to say is that the kind of mystification that we heard before is designed to take that situation, which is absolutely immoral, absolutely indefensible, and say it's okay. It's okay because Israelis are good, Palestinians are bad. It's okay because Israel has to do this. It's okay because that's the necessity. It's not okay. It's not okay for millions of people to live as disenfranchised non-citizens in their own country. It's not okay. And that is the basis of the conflict.
Okay. I would ask Professor Dershowitz to return to the podium. 3-minute response.
I would like to, in my response, pose 5 questions to my opponents. Number 1, specifically, was Arab rejection of the 1948 partition wrong and a cause of the current problem? 2, was the attack on Israel in 1948 and 1967 justified, and was it a cause of the current problem? 3, would Israel be occupying the West Bank and Gaza today if not for terrorism? After all, in the middle of the 1990s, Israel gave back much of the territory and only reoccupied it after the advent of terrorism. And would there be a Palestinian state today with none of the problems that you point to if Arafat had accepted the Clinton-Barak offer of 2000? You can't just look at a photograph. You have to look at a videotape. History is destiny. The Palestinian leadership made tragic mistakes. I agree with their description of the 1948 war as the catastrophe. It was a catastrophe for the world. None of the problems we've heard about today would exist if only they had accepted Israel's right to exist in 48, in 67, and in the year 2000. And now a few specific responses. I don't know where you can say that Israel's policy is the worst policy of ethnic discrimination in the world today. Have you not been in Saudi Arabia? Have you not been in parts of the Arab world where Jews are not able to live freely and with full citizenship? Have you not been to Iraq? You talk about the longest occupation. You're just factually wrong. Tibet has been occupied longer than Israel and with far less justification. You talk about the attack on Jenin. You were on television describing the attack on Jenin as a massacre, talking about hundreds of people, perhaps thousands of people murdered. Jenin was a model of perfect retail warfare. I am proud to be a Jew and a supporter of Israel because of what happened in Jenin. Jenin was a centerpiece of terrorism. Israel had the right under international law to go in and bomb it to oblivion. Instead, it put its own soldiers on the ground retail, resulting in 23 of them dying. The number of Palestinians who died in Jenin were very proportional to the number of Israelis who died in Jenin. They went house to house, risking their life. They did exactly what any other democracy would do. I challenge you to name any other country in the history of modern warfare that has done more to protect enemy civilians from attack at greater risk to its own population. I don't want to be involved in an argument about the tendentiousness of history. Nobody's going to be able to prove who's right and who's wrong. But I challenge you to point specifically to any of the factual claims that I've made about 1948 and 1967 that are wrong. It's not enough just to say they're wrong. Prove that they're wrong, and show me by answering those questions how you think those historical claims relate to the current situation.
Ambassador.
I am not going to waste the 3 minutes I have in answering the questions of Mr. Dershowitz.
Take a few. Take
I am willing to. First of all, in 1948, when the Palestinians rejected the partition plan, because the Palestinians were 2/3 of the country, 1/3 were immigrant Jews who just arrived into the country. 54% of the land was allocated to the Jewish state and 46% to the 2/3. The Palestinians felt like the mother of the child who was supposed to, in the time of Solomon, divided between the real mother and the false mother. And the Palestinians said, no, let's all live together in one single country. The Israelis, the Jewish organizations then, who have conducted a war of terror. I'm going to show you, Mr. Dershowitz, that terrorism was introduced to our country by Mr. Shamir and Mr. Begin. We did not know terrorism before the arrival of the Jewish underground terrorist organizations of the Haganah and the Orgon, who committed the Deir Yassin massacre in 1947. 98 people were killed in the King David Hotel that was blown up by no other than the group of Mr. Begin, who became later the Prime Minister of Israel. Before the arrival of the Jewish underground terrorist organizations who came from Poland and Germany and Russia, we did not know terrorism in our part of the world. So, in fact, this whole, the State of Israel was founded on terrorism. The first major terrorist operation was the one that was conducted against the King David. In fact, 2 prime ministers of Israel were condemned to death by no other than the British mandate in Palestine for terrorism committed against people. They assassinated Count Bernadotte, who was the envoy of the United Nations to Palestine. So I'm not going to get into that because we are not. You are telling me that, Jenin, you are proud to be a Jew in Jenin. Look at the title today, the headline of the Washington Post. I'll read it for you. Merchant son slain as Israeli opened fire at busy Jenin market. Busy Jenin market was shelled by the Israeli tanks yesterday. 4 people killed and 28 injured. I hope you are not proud anymore of this behavior. When the Israeli army, this army that you are proud of, is shelling people in a market. You are asking about Saudi Arabia being against ethnic groups. Saudi Arabia is not occupying any other people. Countries have immigration laws. They want, okay, well, I was promised some of his time, by the way.
He's already used up his time. Thank you very much. Rabbi Batek?
Saudi Arabia is not occupying anyone. That's why they won't allow anyone to go to an election. And the House of Saud is one of the most repressive regimes in the world. We're not going to solve this dispute tonight. Let me invoke JFK, another great son of Harvard. He went to the Berlin Wall. He said, the Russians are saying our system's better. The West is saying we're better. He said, we never had to build a wall to keep our citizens in. If Israel is wrong and the Arabs are right, then free your 400 million people. Then get rid of the secret police and stop jailing dissidents. And go to elections. Bashar al-Assad, go to elections. They amended the Constitution so you could become president at 34 instead of 40. Mubarak, go to elections after 20 years. House of Saud, go to elections. Israel has gone to elections 5 times in 7 years. And all the Arabs within the Green Line vote. But the Palestinians who are devoted to Israel's destruction, it would be insane to give them the vote. And as far as Ambassador Rahman is saying, Palestinian civilians are dying. Arabs, Palestinians, their lives are the equal of every Jewish life. We're all children of the one God. But having said that, Winston Churchill, who was considered the greatest statesman of the 20th century, indiscriminately bombed the city of Dresden, killing 230,000 in one night because he was at war against the Nazis. He then bombed the city of Hamburg, killing 150,000. Truman, who was voted by academics, including here at Harvard, the 3rd best president of the 20th century, dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. War is ugly. And when you decide to destroy a country and you reject the Peel offer of 1937, which would have given the Arabs 3 times as much land as the Jews, when you reject the partition plan of 47, when you wage war in 56, 67, 73, and finally when Yasser Arafat turned this down in the summer 2000, this is according to Dennis Ross, chief American negotiator, this is what he was offered. A, the creation of an independent Palestinian state. B, Israeli withdrawal from 95% of the West Bank. C, Israeli annexation of the remaining 5% in exchange for an equivalent amount of territory in pre-1967 Israel. D, a road to the Temple Mount under Palestinian sovereignty. Next, a secure highway between the West Bank and Gaza. Next, the creation of a Palestinian army. Next, Israeli acknowledgement, quote, of the suffering of the refugees, the absorptions by Israel of tens of thousands of refugees, as well as the full right of return for the refugees to the new Palestinian state. Finally, an international fund for the compensation and the restitutions of Palestinians. He turned it down because the Arabs cannot suffer Israel's existence. Get used to it. And I'll tell you something, as a religious person, I say one final thing. I, as a Jew, am indebted to Muslims around the world because when my people were kicked out by an intolerant Christianity out of Spain in 1492, out of Portugal in 1503, it was the Ottomans who took us in. It was the Quran that said that no one could be forcibly converted to another religion. It was the Muslims who were always tolerant of the Jews and we were brothers. Take your religion back before it becomes known above all else for murder.
Dr. Ibish?
Yeah, so we're back again to the theory of badness. I mean, you just can't get away from it. You know, I mean, it really does come down to this. I mean, either you're going to buy the theory of badness, and I'll repeat what it is. There are good people and bad people, and one of these parties is good, and the other one is just bad, because they were offered everything they've been asking for, and they turned it down because they're bad. They're just bad people. Well, of course, Dennis Ross's description of what was offered or not offered by Barack, by Clinton, Barack, etc., has been disputed by a very large number of people. I'm sure Mr. Abdurrahman will have some detailed words about that. And certainly if you read the exchange in the New York Review of Books, the one thing that shines most clearly is that Ehud Barak says the whole negotiations failed because Arabs are congenital liars. So once again, back to the theory of badness. Look, I suggest that we move away from that kind of mystification, from the kind of mystification that says, hey, war is ugly, from the kind of historical mystification that would ask you to believe that, you know, I was seeing a mirage in 1982 in the summer of Beirut when I was there in Ras Beirut, in West Beirut, watching Israeli bombs falling all around me. And you should believe, in spite of my experience of months of being bombarded by the Israeli military, that Israel has never bombed an Arab city. What I'm and by the way, this business about Tibet, the United Nations Security Council is the international body we have to adjudicate such matters, and it has designated foreign military occupations all over the world. There is only one that is unresolved. It is Israel's occupation of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip. I know you don't like it, but that's the fact. And the people of Tibet may consider themselves occupied. Many people may consider themselves occupied. The UN Security Council has never so designated it. And therefore, under international law, it is clearly doesn't have the same status by any means. And by the way, this summer, the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories surpassed Japan's occupation of Korea by becoming 35 years old and became the longest in contemporary history. You know, I just want to encourage you to think about this outside of, as I say, these tendentious readings of history. You know, I could come back at Professor Dershowitz with my own story of how an entire people were dispossessed of their country that was taken over by a very aggressive movement of people who came from the other side of the world and reduced them to second-class citizens, people living under military occupation, and refugees, which would also be a truthful account of history. But, you know, these competing narratives and competing mythologies do not do anything to get us out of the situation I described. I remind you, there are two equally large groups of people in this country. One of them has all the power, the other one doesn't have any of the power, the other one is disenfranchised. It's, as I said, not okay, and you can't explain it away by appealing to historical narratives, by ideology, or shouting that things are worse in Saudi Arabia. That doesn't matter.
Well, I think, you know, we see quite clearly some of the very deep issues that are at play here. And so far tonight I haven't heard, frankly, a whole lot about reconciliation, but that doesn't surprise me greatly.
I will later.
Okay, that's fine. One thing I would note is that George Mitchell in his work in Northern Ireland was, you know, speaking to a group of unionist MPs and implored them, he said, you know, for heaven's sake, let's forget about the past, you know, let's get on with the future. And one of the responses was, to hell with the future, let's get on with the past. So we just want to, I think we want to focus to some degree on, is there any reason for optimism here, right? Are there solutions to this problem, or are we dealing fundamentally with an intractable situation, and if we come back 1,000 years from now, we'll still see violence and bloodshed in this region? And I think I'm going to sort of try to direct the dialogue a little bit towards the notion of whether or not there is, in fact, solutions or answers here. What I'm going to do in particular is set up to do a few debate-style propositions for our panel. That should say nothing more than test. The ground rules for this are very simple. First of all, I'd ask the participants to stay in their seats at the table and bellow to the large of their ability, because we're only going to have 2 minutes for responses, initial responses, and then 2 minutes for follow-up. And if we move up and down, it's going to be kind of problematic. So here's the first of these propositions. The panelists don't know what these are. I created them. Whoops. And maybe I have them and maybe I don't. Okay, here's one. This conflict could be resolved if the Israelis gave up the political settlements in locations such as Hebron, and the Palestinians gave up the right of return to pre-1967 Israel. And I want to be specific here. I'm not talking about all settlements. You know, there are some that are probably crucial for Israeli security. I'm talking about isolated settlements on hilltops and other places, or in places like Hebron, where a very small number of Jews live amongst a large Palestinian population. And for the other side, I'm going to push you very hard on the right of return, right? And the barrier that it poses to this conflict. Let's start, in this case, I think this one, for the first person, will in fact be Mr. Abdul Rahman. 2 minutes, please.
In relation to the issue of Jewish settlement in Palestinian territories, I believe that we are on record that we are willing to sign a peace treaty with Israel if Israel withdraws to the 1967 boundaries. territories that were occupied in 1967, which constitute 22% of historic Palestine. That, of course, includes East Jerusalem. As far as the issue of Palestinian refugees, this is an issue of human rights and political rights. There has to be a just solution for the refugee problem, and that is negotiable between us and the Israelis. But I believe that it is possible. There are majority of the Israelis who support this solution. There are a majority of the Palestinians who will support peace along those lines. It is possible. I was one of those who are involved in negotiations with the Israelis for 9 years, and we came very, very close. If it was not for the continuation of building Jewish settlement in the West Bank and Gaza after the Oslo, where 100,000 Jews were brought in after we had signed the agreement, I believe it could have been, we could have succeeded in reaching an agreement with Israel. The problem is what is attributed to Dennis Ross, I must say, is not accurate. If Dennis Ross was in my presence here, I would tell him that was totally inaccurate. That was not the offer that was made by Barak. Barak did not make that offer. I was the spokesperson for the Palestinians at Camp David.
Rabbi Wittek?
I wish that the solution to the problem could be as simple as the sign posted behind me. Here's the major problem. It's the problem affecting the United States. It's called terrorism. Even if Israel agreed to this and the Palestinians agreed, we still know that Hamas and Islamic Jihad, who seem to have a far greater following than even Yasser Arafat, are committed to Israel's complete and utter destruction. I'm not making this up. You can go to their websites. There is no compromise. So let's say we make this agreement, and yet every single day there are terror incursions into Israel, and 10 Israelis die drinking coffee, another 20 outside a high school, another 20 outside a disco. Israel will still go to whatever country there is there and say, wait a second, we can't let our citizens die. You have to control terror, as they've been saying since 1993. Arafat's going to say one of two things, which he's been saying since 1993. Either he's going to say, I can't control them, they don't listen to me, and if so, that agreement's gone anyway, or he's going to say, I am doing it, but it becomes a revolving door. Either way, you cannot ignore the issue of terror. The United States went across the world, and our forces are still in Afghanistan, and they'll stay there until they root out the terror. Just like we stayed in Japan, and we're still there, just like we stayed in Germany until democratic institutions were finally set up. The solution to this conflict is the democratization of the Arab governments. And I know that's a long-term solution, but in the immediate short term, it means people, unlike Arafat, who only know tyranny, who doesn't allow his own ministers to criticize him to come to power. Finally, let me just say that when it comes to removing the settlements, as soon as Israel conquered the holiest site in our religion, Temple Mount, we left it in control of the Islamic Waqf. Till today, Jews really aren't allowed to go there. Look at what Sharon did when he went there, where the Arabs, although even I would argue that was orchestrated, but it makes no difference. So why should a Palestinian land have to be Judenrein? This is not Nazi Germany. We didn't kick off. There are 1 million Arabs living inside of Israel. Hebron is a very holy city. We can't be in the place where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are buried. It doesn't have to be Judenrein. And I, as a Jew, and I'm sure Professor Dershowitz, as one of the world's most acclaimed human rights lawyers, would stand up for any Arabs if they were kicked out as Israeli citizens because their citizenship is equal to that of an Israeli.
Thank you, Rabbi. Dr. Vish?
Yeah. It's a little, I'm having a hard time following Mr. Wittek's logic. I mean, he doesn't want to give Palestinians the vote, but he doesn't want to allow them their freedom either, so he seems to be in favor of an apartheid arrangement here. What he's doing, by the way, this issue of making terrorism the central issue, the classical rhetorical term for this piece of sophistry is a metalepsis, which means the substitution of an effect for a cause, right? He's taking an effect of the conflict, a tactic, a strategic moment, an effect of the conflict, and making it the cause of the conflict. It's as I say, it's a classical technique of sophistry called a metalepsis. This question here is very interesting because what it gets to is the crux of the two-state solution, right? Israel, in order for the two-state solution to be viable, Israel would have to withdraw to virtually the borders of June 4th, 1967, with territorial adjustments to mutually agreed upon to clear up some anomalies, right? I think that's clear to absolutely everybody who takes the two-state solution seriously. The issue of the settlements here sort of stands in for the question of whether Israel, any Israeli government, is actually really willing to consider actually really ending the occupation. So far, that hasn't happened in spite of the fairy tales about wonderful offers of the moon and everything at Camp David. The other question, of course, is the question of the right of return. And, you know, the right of return cannot be renounced because it is a human right guaranteed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the Geneva Convention, the Fourth Geneva Convention, which, by the way, Article 7 says that no protected people, and refugees are protected people, can renounce in whole or in part any of the rights afforded to them by the Geneva Convention. So it actually would be an unlawful thing for anyone to try to renounce the right of return. However, obviously, in the context of a bona fide two-state solution that involves the return to the Israeli borders that I've described and the creation of a Palestinian state, there would have to be an arrangement made which recognized both the right of some of the Palestinians to get their right to choose whether to return or not, and the legitimate interests of Israel as a Jewish state as part of a two-state solution, right? Otherwise, it's up for grabs.
Thank you. Professor Dershowitz?
Well, I favor the end of all of the settlements, except for those that are strategically necessary to protect the central population. I favor it completely, whether or not it would lead to peace. I don't agree with the settlements, never have. 78% of Israelis would like to see the settlements end. I do think that ending the settlements in return for the Palestinians giving up not a right, there's no right to return. There are millions of refugees in the world today from the Sudetenland, from other parts of the world. You learn to live with changing of populations. There was a major exchange of populations in 1948. About 400,000 to 700,000 Palestinians had to move back to land where they had lived to previously. Many of them had come to the Israeli section of Palestine, attracted there by job opportunities presented by the Jewish settlements. They had to return, and many Jews had to leave Iraq and Yemen and many other countries. That's a fait accompli. That should never even be put on the table. It's an argument stopper for everybody. But I do think that that exchange of giving back what Israel is not entitled to, which is settlements in the occupied territories, for something that Palestinians are not entitled to, a right of return, might clarify the situation. Perhaps I am a metallipsicist, but I absolutely categorically believe that terrorism is not an effect. Terrorism has been the tactic of first choice by the Palestinians, started in 1929, well before the Irgun and the Stern Gang existed, the murders in Hebron, continuing to this day. Terrorism started globally in 1968 when the occupation was less than a year old. There's now increasing evidence that Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah may be working together. Terrorism is the crux of the problem. If not for terrorism, Israel would have ended the occupation in the middle 90s. They only reoccupied as the result of terrorism. Terrorism is the cause, terrorism is the problem, and ending terrorism is the solution.
Okay. Each of the panelists has an additional 2 minutes to respond to the previous commentators on this issue, but you could also choose, for example, to comment on what you think in fact should be done here. Let's begin again with Mr. Abdul-Rahman.
You know, I find it much easier to debate with Israeli Jews than with American Jews. It is much easier for me really to negotiate with Israeli Jews than with American Jews. Because the Israeli Jews want to live, most of them at least, with the exception of the extreme right, want to live in peace with the Palestinians. I am not, and I have never denied that we have extremist Palestinians too. But the extremist Palestinians are the opposition today among the Palestinians. The extremist Israelis are the government of Israel today. You have the Likud government led by Mr. Sharon, who is advocating the building of Jewish settlements in the Palestinian territories. Anyone who wants to build Jewish settlements in the Palestinian territories is providing a prescription for continuation of conflict and tension. I challenge my friend Mr. Dershowitz tonight and the rabbi to condemn killing of Palestinian civilians in as much as I condemn the killing of Jewish civilians by Palestinians. I am opposed to suicide bombing. I am opposed to killing of civilians. I am for the establishment of two independent states, a Palestine next to Israel, to live in peace, but as equals and not as superior and inferior. The issue of democratization, Rabbi, is an issue that I will struggle for, and I don't need you to tell me about it, because I want, first of all, to become independent from foreign occupation while struggling to achieve democracy. You cannot justify the continuation of occupation by referring or running away to dealing with the issue of democratization.
Thank you very much,
democracy,
Mr. Rabbi.
we want
We've got to
freedom,
stop at this point.
but we want freedom also from occupation.
Thank you. Rabbi Bote?
Ambassador Rahman, I believe you when you tell me that you are opposed to suicide bombings. And therefore, sir, since you are, I believe to be, and have demonstrated yourself to be a very decent man, you should resign your position as the ambassador for the Palestinian Authority.
And
because Yasser Arafat, if you say that you oppose the official or unofficial policy of your government, you should resign, sir. Because Yasser Arafat's signature was found on many documents that were captured by the Israeli military. You can go and see them on the Israeli government website. No one in the Palestinian Authority disputes their authenticity. You can see Yasser Arafat's handwritten notes giving $300 to this proposition for a bomb, to this group that wants to bomb. Yasser Arafat has orchestrated this. For those of you who don't believe it, let me just tell you the exact words of Imad Faluji, the Palestinian Authority communications minister. The uprising, this is the second intifada, which has now claimed the lives of 800 innocent Israeli civilians, which prorated for the United States. I was never good at mathematics, but you do the calculation. What are we talking, 60, 70,000 people? Imagine that many Americans dying in terror. Imagine the outrage, the uproar in this country, what we would expect from our government to do to protect its citizens if we were at that number, what we did even after 3,000 in New York. Imad Faluji said, the uprising had been planned since Chairman Arafat's return from Camp David, when he returned the tables on the former U.S. president and rejected the American conditions. The Mitchell report of May 4th, 2001 found officially, this is official United States government report, the Sharon visit did not cause the Al-Aqsa Intifada. Yasser Arafat is an embarrassment to the Palestinian people. I have a daily national radio show. I have interviewed great men, Palestinian leaders like Saeb Erekat, who has never said this, but you get the feeling that even they are ashamed of the leadership that they have because he has consistently undermined. Where has he led his people into utter oblivion? Hence, I am shocked and outraged that Dr. Ibish, an official spokesman for the Arab community in the United States, would call terrorism a cause, as if to justify indiscriminate, an effect, as if to justify indiscriminate murder. And we can laugh about this, but as if to justify the indiscriminate murder of men, women, and children. When the Jews were subjected to genocide by the Nazis, they never resorted to killing men, women, and children. When the Dalai Lama, as Professor Dershowitz said, never called for that. The Kurds, who against Saddam Hussein, never resorted to killing men, women, and children. And finally, the Armenians, 1.5 million killed by the Turks, never resorted to killing men, women, and children.
Thank you, Rabbi. Go ahead, Dr. Bish.
You really do have to torture what I said to bend it into any kind of justification or rationalization. I am calling it an effect because that is what it is. It is not the cause. The cause is what I described before, and that is in no way a justification for the evil acts of certain extremist groups. Neither is there any way to justify the Israeli government's killing of about 4 times as many unarmed Palestinians. To Professor Dershowitz, there is a right of return. You're flat out wrong about that. We went to war in Kosovo to defend that right, and the UN Security Council has just referred to the inalienable right of refugees to return. The inalienable inalienable right in a resolution a couple of years ago on the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. So the right of return is a bedrock element of our universal system of individual human rights, and we can't be dispensed with. Of course, as I said, Israel's interests in being a Jewish state in the context of a two-state solution would also have to be factored in heavily to any modalities for implementing the right of return. As far as this question of terrorism and other forms of violence in the occupied territories being a justification for the continued occupation. If resistance, whether legitimate or illegitimate, and attacks on Israeli civilians are clearly not legitimate forms of resistance, but lots of what the Palestinians have been doing, both violent and non-violent, are legitimate forms of resistance. The presence of resistance cannot justify occupation, right? Otherwise, all occupations will be self-justifying and never end. That is why it is the right of people recognized under international law to resist. Even an Israeli court agreed in the ongoing trial of Marwan Barghouti that Palestinians have a right to militarily resist the Israeli occupation forces. And in Lebanon, the Israelis said continuously for 12 years, we can't withdraw our occupation of southern Lebanon because of the resistance. But in the end, Israel did withdraw. And as I'm saying, once you accept the logic that resistance justifies occupation, no occupation will ever end because occupations become self-justifying. And that's unacceptable.
Professor Dershowitz.
Unlike the ambassador, I'm going to directly answer his question. I condemn the killing of all civilians by Israel and condemn the killing of all civilians by the Palestinians. But there is a difference. We live in a world of good and evil, notwithstanding your moral relativism. There is an enormous difference between bad people who target innocent civilians and deliberately and willfully kill them, and good people who try to defend their population and accidentally and tragically in the process kill innocent people. Ambassador Rahman, you mentioned the case of that tragic child who was killed in the arms of his father. To this day, we don't know whether it was an Israeli or a Palestinian bullet. But the Israeli people sat collective shiva. They were so appalled at what happened. There were no cheers, there were no claps, there were no applauses. But when a little while later a pizzeria was blown up and dozens of Israeli children were murdered, they made a mock-up of that pizzeria in Birzeit University and cheered in the street, just the way the Palestinians cheered in the street and from the rooftops when Scuds were attacking civilians. There is good and bad. There is a difference between history and fiction. And unless you understand the lessons of history, you will be condemned to repeat them. So we must remember history. We must remember the difference between good and evil. And we must build on the process to achieve good. Now, I don't disagree with some of the solutions. I do think that we have to look at how we can build for the future. And I do think we have to look to the future and not focus completely on the past. But we can't build the future without remembering the past. And we can't allow this kind of terrorism to become the option of first choice. If we reward terrorism, as Tom Friedman says, it's coming to a theater near you. So this transcends Israel and the Palestinians. Terrorism can never, ever be tolerated or rewarded.
Thanks to you all for your comments on that proposition. I'm going to give you a second proposition now. The proposition is this: the U.S. has a constructive role to play in resolving the conflict in the Middle East. And I mean by the U.S., of course, the U.S. government. And we'll begin, in this case, with Rabbi Botev.
I'm sorry, forgive me, could you repeat the question, please?
Sure.
I was always bad at paying attention in class, and I feel like I'm back at university now, so I'm sorry.
No problem. The United States government, I'll add the word government, has a constructive role to play in resolving the conflict in the Middle East.
You know, I think that's absolutely true, especially with President George W. Bush has finally stood up courageously and said that leaders that are tainted by terrorism will not be allowed to negotiate with the United States, and yet Yasser Arafat remains in power. I think that was not true when President Clinton met with Yasser Arafat 16 times, and as Professor Dershowitz, who, by the way, I want to salute as one of Israel's most eloquent defenders anywhere in the world. Professor Dershowitz makes the argument so persuasively in his book, Why Terrorism Works, that what we have to say to terrorists is, sorry, that you kill people, we're not even going to try to understand. Don't tell us about causes. President Clinton was a great friend of the Jewish people. He had many Jewish members of the cabinet. But I always compared him to like a Jewish mother that's going to marry off her daughter no matter what. Doesn't make a difference whether the suitor is the right guy. She has to be married off. There had to be a peace deal. I was with Elie Wiesel the only time I met President Clinton. He was a lame duck president. It was November 30th, 2000. And I was at a particular fundraiser. And he said to Elie Wiesel in front of us, while there was daily bombings against Israeli civilians, he said, Elie, there still may be a peace deal. And we looked at each other like he's not in the world of reality. And of course, that's what happened. I think that the American government can play a role by enforcing the Bush Doctrine, which is first stop the terror, then we will talk. Because I would love to see my Arab and Jewish brothers living in harmony. But I know that cannot happen so long as we murder each other and use violence as a last resort. If you went to the 93 Oslo Accords and you said we're going to discuss this and resolve it through discussion, you cannot then resort to violence. I had 30 seconds left. That's amazing. I have never ended early any time in my life. It's a miracle, the miracle of Hanukkah.
Yeah,
there it is.
Dr. Bush?
Well, just let me begin by noting that I'm glad that Professor Dershowitz agrees that the basic theory he's proposing is that there are good people and bad people. The problem is what he's basically been saying is, the Israelis are good people and the Arabs are bad people. And that his reading of history that he opened up with was all premised on that notion. I agree there are good people and bad people. I agree that there are evil things, but I don't believe that national identity groups like Israelis and Palestinians can be described as generally good and generally bad, which is basically what we've been hearing tonight. And so that's why I present this structural analysis to try to help us move beyond the second grade here. He's also suggesting, by the way, that all of the Arabs and, for instance, the 2,500 Palestinian civilians who've been killed recently by the Israelis, it was all just a mistake. I mean, every Israeli who gets killed by a Palestinian, that's a heinous act of murder and terrorism, but with the greater numbers of Palestinians who've been killed, oops, just that's the way it goes, war is ugly, it's an absurdity, it's an insult to your intelligence. Now, as to this question, of course the United States has an important role to play in the process. The United States is on record as supporting the two-state solution, as is the UN, the EU, etc. But you know what, and that's called a vision by the Bush administration, which means it's a policy goal. The problem is we have a schizophrenic approach to this question because our de facto policies amount to uncritical, unconditional support for Israel and its colonial occupation. Right? That's our day-to-day policies. And in fact, it's not just a contradiction, it's an absolute blockage. Our policies of uncritical support for Israel and its colonial occupation are the really only thing, along with the Israeli army, which we subsidize, that actually is preventing the creation of a two-state solution. So we have right now a completely incoherent policy. And it's really because of this distinction between the national interest, which dictates a two-state solution and our enthusiastic support for that, but the very powerful collection of special interests, large Jewish organizations, evangelical Christians groups, neoconservatives, defense contractors, etc., who demand this unconditional support for Israel. It's a very powerful special interest lobby that has created this total contradiction between our actual policies and our policy goals. Until we can figure out what the hell we want, then we can't be of much good.
Professor Dershowitz?
My friend here apparently doesn't like democracy because democracy shows that in America, the vast majority of Americans, in fact, support Israel. America is the only honest broker in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. Certainly the UN is not. The UN has put the PLO in the United Nations. It's never put the Kurds, the Armenians, the Basques, the Tibetans, the Chechens. You hear that the Tibetans aren't recognized by the UN. That's the UN's problem. The UN is part of the problem, not part of the solution. It picks and chooses. It rewards terrorism. It defines terrorism so as to exclude the killing of Jews. It rewards terrorism by singling out only a terrorist organization, the PLO, for this special status at the United nations. You talk about the colonial Israel. Israel became a state fighting colonialism, fighting British colonialism. It was British colonialism that prevented Jews from coming to Israel, Palestine in those days, and surviving the Holocaust. It was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and you can't forget history, who spent the Second World War at Hitler's side, urging the Hungarian government to send its Jews to Auschwitz rather than to send them to Palestine. That's bad. The leadership of the Palestinian movement in general has been bad. And in fact, the leadership, that's right, I'm acknowledging that. It's down to badness. A lot of it is down to badness. And a lot of it is down to the difference between singling out people from murder who are civilians and trying your best to protect innocent civilians and killing people in the process. That's what America does. That's what other democracies do. And that's not what the Palestinians have done. And if you don't understand the difference between targeting civilians and bombing terrorist camps that are purposely hidden on the outskirts of Beirut in order to create Israeli overreaction that then becomes the cause that you can complain against, then you don't understand the difference between fighting a just moral war and fighting an unjust war which targets the most vulnerable civilians. That's the difference between good and bad. And failure to understand that difference will inevitably produce lack of resolution about this. You know, I don't have time to complete my thought.
Thank you, Professor Dershowitz. Mr. Abdurrahman.
I agree killing civilians is bad, but lying also is very, very bad. To distort history is extremely bad. And that's what Mr. Dershowitz tonight was engaged in. Really, he was engaged in distortion of history.
Be specific.
Let me tell you. First of all, Israel is a colonial settler state. It was not, those people who created Israel were not people who were born in Palestine. They immigrated into Palestine. In order to build the state of Israel, 485 cities and towns were demolished. 750,000 Palestinians were turned into refugees. So this, in the eyes of the Palestinian, is terrorism. It is a state-sponsored terrorism. Israel, in the eyes of the Palestinians, is engaged in terrorism against the Palestinian people. When you send your tanks, your Apache helicopters, your F-16 to bombard civilian targets, that is a state-sponsored terrorism. That's why I agree with you. Terrorism is bad. And the policies of the State of Israel, which were condemned by everyone, including Israeli Jewish human rights organizations like B'Tselem, by Amnesty International, which called Israeli action in Jenin as war crimes. And by the way, I never said on television that Israel committed a massacre. I said Israel committed war crimes. There's a difference between massacre and war crimes. When you attack civilians, targets with tanks and Apache helicopters, and kill civilians and demolish homes over Palestinian civilians, that is war crimes. And no one debates the fact that Israel was engaged in and continued to engage in war crimes in the Palestinian territories. Second, the Palestinian people are ready to engage with the Israelis in a peaceful settlement, with one condition, as I said, is for Israel to stop its settlement policies, withdraw those Jews settlers who are extremists, who are engaged in stealing Palestinian land, in stealing their crops, like you have...
Ambassador, we have to stop at this point.
Okay,
Thank you.
Because really it's...
But you're gonna get 2 more minutes, sir. So, all right, we're going to go back to the top of the batting order, Rabbi Boteach. I would urge the speakers to take a look at the proposition. Rabbi Boteach, I'm sorry. It's your 2 minutes, sir.
Is this our last 2 minutes?
On this particular proposition, yes. Then we'll have some audience Q&A, and then you're going to get time for some final statements, final closing statements.
Okay, I'm going to sort of break the rules, to be honest, because I feel that I've said all I can on that. Of course, the United States has a constructive role, and I hope to continue to play it. I took Reverend Al Sharpton on a solidarity mission to Israel for Israeli victims of terror, and he wanted to meet with Arafat in Gaza City. This is before the Yasser Arafat's headquarters were blown up, so I saw the building while it was still there. And I refused to meet Yasser Arafat. I waited downstairs. I have to say, the Palestinians could not have been nicer to me. They could not have been more hospitable. They even said, could they get me lunch? I said, I'm kosher. They said, we don't have kosher restaurants in the Gaza Strip. But I have to tell you that I waited the entire time in a presidential reception room. And in that presidential reception room, where Yasser Arafat meets with presidents, prime ministers, there was a map on the wall. It was a map of Israel. It was covered entirely by a Palestinian flag. And I looked at some of my hosts and I said, you know, we're here, peace, etc. That flag, this is where he greets world leaders. And there's no Israel. And it's a Palestinian flag. And I saw it with my own eyes. And the guy shrugged his shoulders and said, you know, why make an issue of this? And I was a guest. I didn't make an issue of it there. But this is the main issue. The Arabs have to begin to accept Israel's there to stay. And the Jews aren't going. And if they have to continue to, God forbid, absorb many more casualties, they will do so. And it's only when the Arabs accept Israel's permanence as something that will not change will they be ready to make peace. Let me finally say, in looking for how peace might come about and addressing the religious issue again, because I am a rabbi, our greatest thinker of all time was Maimonides. Of all time. He was the personal physician to Sultan Saladin. He loved Islam. He was very critical of Christianity. He praised Islam to the hilt, and he influenced 300 or 400 years of Islamic philosophy. Perhaps through Judaism and Islam agreeing at least on the rule of law, at least agreeing that the Ten Commandments, do not murder. Maybe if it could trickle down, if instead of religion being used as a form of inflaming and inciting the situation, that rabbis and imams got together and said, first and foremost, we are charged with the responsibility of safeguarding human life, Palestinian lives, Israeli lives, and we must tell the politicians that we will not in any way ever condone the targeting of civilians. I believe that that might trickle down, because what always has impressed me about the Palestinians in general, the Arabs in general, the Palestinians in particular, is that they were very religious people. I was very close to the Muslim students at Oxford. I was very proud of the fact that I was able to get them things like meat. I mean, it was difficult for them to get halal meat. I believe that religion can play a constructive role, and I would look forward to meeting with Islamic moderate imams who want to take their faith back from the radicals.
Thank you, Rabbi. You'll notice I gave him back some of his 30 seconds there. So that's fine. Let's move along to Dr. Ibish, please.
Yeah. You notice, by the way, with apropos of what the rabbi just said, that there are two Arabs sitting here in front of you, and neither of us has been talking about the destruction of Israel. Neither of us has been resistant to the idea of making an arrangement. I mean, look, listen to us and listen to what we're saying. As far as Mr. Dershowitz goes, and I'll come back to this question in a second, yeah, it's down to badness, right? So I'm going to appeal to you. I mean, do you really think that a conflict of this size involving entire societies and millions of people is really down to the goodness of one side and the badness of the other? I mean, as I say, I really think we need to move out of kindergarten here into a much more complex reading of the reality. Of course, there's good people and bad people at an individual level, and there are good acts and bad acts, no doubt about that. But the notion that the entire conflict boils down to the basic badness of an entire group of people versus the basic goodness of another group of people is, I think, on its face, preposterous. And I think I urge you all to ask for something slightly better than that from your analysis. Now, as for the United States, Mr. Dershowitz Professor Dershowitz, excuse me, is absolutely wrong about American public opinion. And this is why pro-Israeli groups and the Israeli Foreign Ministry have spent hundreds of millions of dollars in the past 2 years on television advertisements, polls, focus groups, surveys, because they've been reading the same polling data that I have, and this is talked about a lot in the Israeli press. 3/4 of Americans believe in the creation of a Palestinian state. 3/4 of them blame both sides for the conflict. 3/4 of them want aggressive American diplomacy, and at least 50 to 60% want to use aid to Israel as leverage on Israel. There is no doubt American public opinion is not reflected either by the wishes of Israel or by our own day-to-day de facto policies that I talked about, uncritical support for Israel and its colonial occupation. So read the polls more carefully.
Professor Dershowitz.
I can imagine a conversation like this occurring in the mid-1930s and Neville Chamberlain saying there's no such thing as good or evil. Let's get peace in our time. Let's try to figure out a resolution to the problem of the Germans trying to destroy the Jews and occupy. That would have been wrong. There were bad people in those days. Yasser Arafat is a truly, genuinely evil man. He has, with his own voice, murdered American diplomats. 2 in the Sudan. The CIA has a tape of him giving the order, let the cold river run. When they found the body of the highest-ranking African-American diplomat beaten to death as the result of Yasser Arafat's direct order, he was beaten so badly that they couldn't tell which of the diplomats was white, which of the diplomats was black. Yasser Arafat personally ordered the murder of 11 Israeli Olympic athletes in Munich. He personally was involved in the shooting down of a Swiss airplane in which 43 innocent people were murdered. He is bad. He is evil. There are other evil, bad leaders among the Palestinian people. And there are some Israelis. Obviously, Israel is a democracy. Sharon's campaign manager has been Yasser Arafat. He's the man who has caused the election of Sharon. I'm not a supporter of Sharon, but I don't vote in Israeli elections, whereas Palestinian elections are sham. There's no such thing as a Palestinian election. You vote against Arafat, you get a bullet in the back of your head. If you become an informer for Israel, you get tortured and get a bullet in the back of your head. The fact that the Palestinians and the Arab countries are not democracies is not your problem. It's our problem. Democracies don't wage aggressive war against civilian population. Tyrannies do. The best guarantee for peace is democracy. And until we get democracy in the Middle East and among the Arab states, there will be no guarantee of peace. Democracy is crucial, and understanding the fact that there are evil people in this world, and when people put evil people in charge, they bear the consequences of that evil.
Our final speaker on this proposition will be Ambassador Alvin Rachman. Following this, we're going to go to some audience questions. I suggest that if you're interested in asking a question, you might consider beginning to populate behind the microphones.
First of all the allegations that Mr. Dershowitz just made tonight about Yasser Arafat is totally inaccurate, because I want you to ask American officials who are engaged in investigation of those events. None of them is true. And that's why there is a question of credibility of what Mr. Dershowitz is saying here tonight. Because
I heard it from the highest authority in the United States.
in Israel maybe, but not in the United States. You are
highest
totally
authority on the
inaccurate.
Excuse me, please,
You are
Professor
totally
Dershowitz.
inaccurate,
Thank you.
Mr. Dershowitz. I am telling you because those issues were raised by the U.S. government, and the U.S. government could not prove any of this, including what was alleged by the rabbi here, who is a man of religion, about Yasser Arafat signing money to bombs, and because this was never verified by any American intelligence service. This is one thing. Second, about the flag, he said that the Palestinian flag covers all of it. Have you ever seen a flag of Israel? Did you ever see a map in Mr. Sharon's office? Did you see a Palestinian state on an Israeli map? How do you expect the Palestinians to have an Israel on their map, and Israel does not have a Palestinian state on their map? When Israel puts a Palestinian state on their map, I assure you there will be a map of Israel on the Palestinian map. So let's settle this. Third, about the United States, I don't believe that the United States is an honest broker. The United States is an indispensable broker. When I used to tell the Americans in our discussions, this is unfair, and they will answer me, life is not fair. Don't expect us. There are reasons for us being pro-Israel. But I believe that they are not an honest, even-handed broker. They are an indispensable broker, and their role is needed.
Thank you, Ambassador Rachman. We now have roughly about 10 minutes for questions. That's going to mean that many of you behind the microphones are probably going to come away disappointed. I'm just going to move between the two microphones. Please direct your question to one of the panelists. Keep it to a question, and we'll begin with you.
I have a question for Ambassador.
Please just identify yourself.
My name is Jeff Rhodes. I'm a second-year student at HBS. Question for the Ambassador. You said that the offer, which was identified by Dennis Ross, was he's misrepresented the offer that was actually made to you and Chairman Arafat at Camp David. My question is, if you had indeed received the offer that was read earlier today, would you and Chairman Arafat have accepted it at the time? If yes, would you still find such an agreement acceptable now? And if no, what additional territories and terms would you need to find it acceptable?
I believe that what he's talking about is not an offer that was made at Camp David.
I'm saying if it had been made, would you have accepted it?
I'm going to it was made by President Clinton on January 2nd, on January 9th, in fact, in 2001. And we said yes, and we continued to negotiate with Israel on the basis of this offer until the election of Mr. Sharon, and Mr. Sharon suspended the negotiations. The last meeting that was held in Taba between Shlomo Ben Ami, who was the foreign minister of Israel, and Mr. Abu Ala, who is the head of the Palestine National Council, was held in Taba in January 26, just a few days before the Israeli elections. We continued to negotiate on the basis of this. The negotiation was suspended by Mr. Sharon and not by the Palestinians.
But the offer that was read earlier.
Please, we're not going to be able to do follow-up
questions. It's the basis for the agreement. I said yes.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I did. Okay, answer it for me.
Folks, every minute we spend doing this is a minute that someone else doesn't get to ask a question, all right?
My name is Tal Ben Shahar. I'm a PhD student at the business school. My question is to you, Ambassador Rahman. You said that you came here to talk about a two-state solution. Mr. Abish also seconded your sentiments. How can you say that when, as the Rabbi pointed out, the official maps of the Palestinian Authority, the group you represent, are on the entire state of Israel? How can you say that when every agreement signed at Oslo has been violated by the Palestinians, including the Karine A, and using the weapons Israel gave the Palestinians against Israelis? And finally, when Arafat and the likes of Husseini talk about the Oslo Accords as a Trojan horse, as a first step in a phased plan to destroy Israel, and these are official records, how can you, as their representative, talk about a two-state solution?
Well, listen, I'm here representing the Palestinian Authority, and I'm responsible for every word that I say. As an official Palestinian position, I would tell you that we are committed to the two-state solution. We submitted to the Americans 34 violations of Israel of the Oslo Accords. Israel violated the Oslo Accords. In spite of all of this, we are willing to continue negotiations with Israel when Israel is ready for negotiations. It was Mr. Sharon who suspended the negotiations after his election. We asked him to continue the negotiations. He refused. The Americans formulated a roadmap now with the other three parties, the United Nations, Europe, and Russia, and we accepted it in principle. Israel sent their envoys last week to Washington, begging the American government not to present the roadmap which would lead to the implementation of Mr. Bush's vision. We are ready. I'm responsible for what I'm saying. I want an equal, clear response from the Israelis that they are ready for the two-state solution.
Can you please respond to my question of a Trojan horse that is on record?
That's absolutely inaccurate. That's why I'm answering you that is totally inaccurate. Yasser Arafat never said it. He never fails to say that it is the peace of the brave, and he calls on Israel to continue negotiations, and Mr. Sharon refuses.
Thank you. Yes.
My name is Yael Hadass. I'm a PhD student here at Harvard, a political economy program. I have a question.
Who are you directing the question to?
To Mr. Abdul Rahman and Hussein Ibish.
Someone here is popular, right?
Well, the other Palestinian representatives, and I have a question for them. Until Camp David negotiations, there was a peace process going on for several years between the Israeli and the Palestinians. And in Camp David in I believe it was the summer of 2000, the Palestinian Barak has offered Arafat a deal that Arafat refused to accept, which is his right. My question is, after that, after this negotiation has failed, the Intifada 2000 has erupted and has started. So basically, the fact that we were in a peace process completely was eliminated because all of a sudden we start a war. So,
Okay, and your question is?
so my question is, what exactly is the thing that you want? Because you were in a peace negotiations, and after the deal was not achieved, which is happening many times, you start.
I think we got it. Thanks.
I think people tend to make certain allegations and then they believe themselves. On the 29th of September, the day the Intifada erupted, we were negotiating in Washington Israeli-Palestinian American delegations. The day Mr. Sharon went to Al-Haram al-Sharif. And 2 days earlier, we had asked Mr. Barak, I myself, and you can ask Mr. Dennis Ross, ask him to convince Mr. Sharon not to go to Al-Haram al-Sharif because this will lead to an interruption of our negotiations. He went anyway. Palestinians demonstrated. Israeli shot at them. The first day there were 7 Palestinians killed and 200 wounded by Israel. In 5 days, the first 5 days of the Intifada, 49 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli army without one Israeli was killed. That's what Mr. Mitchell in his report refers to when he says that the causes of the Intifada was not necessarily caused by Mr. Sharon's visit, but it was caused by the excessive use of military force by Israel in quelling Palestinian civilian demonstrations.
I'd like to add one more thing, which is since you included me in your question, the Mitchell Commission report is very clear. It's extremely clear on the causes, and it's the definitive investigation by 5 people who are friends of Israel. They're not. This was not the UN independent investigation Palestinians want, but the American-centered one that the Israelis wanted. The conclusions were very clear that there was not one single shred of evidence presented to the Mitchell Commission to substantiate this claim that Palestinians had deliberately launched a violent uprising against Israel in order to, as the Israeli myth goes, to achieve on the ground what they couldn't achieve in negotiations. And in fact, that as Mr. Abdurrahman has said, that according to the Mitchell Commission, which you can read online, the proximate cause of the violence was the decision of the Israeli border police to open fire on unarmed Palestinian demonstrators. And the report is unequivocal on that. Furthermore, negotiations continued. They continued straight through to January. They continued until the election of General Sharon. So, I mean, this mythology just is a complete nonsense. I mean, you can't, if it makes you feel better, you may believe it, but it's not true.
We're going to give Professor Dershowitz a chance to respond here, too.
You are right to believe it because let me just quote you from the Palestinian Authority. This is the evidence of the Palestinian Authority itself. It says the PA had begun to prepare for the outbreak of the Intifada as soon as the negotiations broke down. It was not a specific protest against Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount. The Intifada was no surprise to the Palestinian leadership. Clearly, the Palestinians...
Professor Dershowitz, what's the source of that, please?
The source of it is...
Dershowitz.
Page... No. Yes, but... Footnote 29, I'll give you the exact source. Page 79. No, let me give you... You've challenged my sources. That's a very serious matter for an academic. Footnote 29, and it comes from a story in the New York Times, 3/31/2002.
So it is not the Palestinian Authority.
No. It's quoting.
It's okay. We're going to stop. That's fine. I think we got a clear sense of the issues here. We're going to take one more question.
The communication minister. The source is the communication minister of the Palestinian Authority. Do not shout me down. That's the source. What I read you is a quote. I will bet you right now an Israeli bond that this is a direct quotation from the information minister of the Palestinian Authority. Do you take that bet?
Well, it's not. It is a lie. It is a lie.
But it's a lie.
All right, folks, thank you. I think we'll break the
It's a lie.
Boston Globe in a few minutes. We have time for one more
Mitchell
question.
Commission
and
is
closing
online. You
statements,
can
and
read it
that's all. I
yourselves.
regret that that's the case, but we only have time for one question. You can pose it.
Hi, my name is Adam Mayer. I'm a second year at the business school. In HBS spirit, I'm going to build on her question. I guess I'd ask either Mr. Abbas or Mr. Rahman, exactly if Sharon and the Israeli government, all of Israel, would listen to you exactly what you wanted, from a big picture level, what would you want? And if they did exactly what you said, how would the Hamas and other extremist Palestinian groups respond?
You know, I'm going to answer you. In 1994, when we arrived in the West Bank and Gaza, Hamas had 24% support among the Palestinian public. When the peace process was moving forward, by 2000, Hamas went down to 6% in support among the Palestinians. Why? The peace process was succeeding. There was a light at the end of the tunnel. Today, Hamas is back to 24-25% support among the Palestinians. Hamas is a phenomenon that will become stronger when there's no peace process, when there's confrontation. If there is a peace process, it is the overwhelming majority of the Palestinians who support peace. If Mr. Sharon offers the Palestinian people only occupation and more Jewish settlements in the Palestinian and more repression and more killing, I assure you that maybe 90% of the Palestinians will support Hamas. The day there is a peace plan on the table and the Palestinian people feel that their tragic existence is coming to an end, they will come around and support a peace process. And as I said, we agree to what has been agreed to by the international community, a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, side by side with Israel, a solution, a just solution for the refugee problem, which we would negotiate with Israel. That is the only way to achieve peace for our two peoples. I believed in that. I negotiated with the Israelis. I believe that most of the Israelis support this kind of a settlement. That is the deal, that if we kill 10,000 Palestinians or the Israelis kill 100,000 Palestinians, we will come back to this solution. There's no way out of it.
Okay, thank you. I regret to the rest of you at the microphones that we're just not going to be able to take any more questions this evening. What I'd like to do now is turn to closing statements. The panelists have up to 4 minutes to make their closing statements. They don't need to use all that unless they really absolutely feel they have to. We'll begin with Dr. Ibish.
From the podium?
Yes. Okay. If you wish.
So as I told you when I first stepped forward, what you're going to get from the other side is the theory of badness. And I'm returning to it because it really is asking you to believe something absolutely preposterous, which is that an entire society is basically bad, the other society is basically good. So because of that, it's okay that there are millions of people who live under foreign military domination, who are the largest group of non-citizens in the world, who experience this kind of unparalleled in the contemporary world system of economic, social, and political discrimination in the occupied territories. It's okay because it's their fault, because they're bad. Or if they're not bad, at least their leaders are bad. Let me tell you something. There isn't an Arab on this planet who doesn't believe that Sharon is a bad man, right? There are lots of Israeli leaders who I would describe as bad people, who've been involved in killings, in assassinations, in what I would certainly think would meet any objective definition of terrorism you could create. I think, however, that we really need to move beyond the theory of badness and look at the structure of the conflict. I'm going to remind you, there are equal numbers of Palestinians and Israelis in this country. And one group has all the power, and the other group, in the main, is not even citizens. So when it comes to reconciliation, as I said, a modicum of equality is required because you cannot have reconciliation between masters and slaves. It just doesn't happen. The easiest route to get there, to equality, is for Palestinians and Israelis to relate to each other as citizens of equally sovereign states, not equally large, equally rich, equally powerful, but equally sovereign states, right? The only force in the world that is opposing this is the Israeli government, which, as I have said, has just admonished its UN representative for daring to talk about a two-state solution. Everybody else is in favor of that. You've heard Mr. Abdurrahman speak rather eloquently about the extent to which him and his organization and government entity that he represents, the authority, is in favor and is pursuing precisely that policy. If you don't believe in a two-state solution, and you don't believe in a single democratic state, which wouldn't be a Jewish state or a Palestinian state, then you believe either in a position of a permanent condition of apartheid, as exists now in the occupied territories, indeed worse than apartheid, or the only other option is ethnic cleansing, because that is always you could simply redraw the equation by not having equal numbers of people anymore, by moving them out. It is an option. It is an ugly option. There are a very limited number of scenarios that can come out of the situation that I just suggested. A single equal state, a single state based on democracy and equality, two states that are equally sovereign, or ethnic cleansing. There really isn't a fourth option, because when people are subjected to this kind of disenfranchisement and this kind of discrimination, and there are equal numbers of them in a single country, there will be conflict. You can take the situation I just described to you and put it anywhere in the world and involve any two different national groups, and there is going to be conflict. It's inevitable. Not one of you living in this room would submit to living as a non-citizen under foreign military occupation for 35 years with no end in sight. All of you would struggle to achieve your freedom and your liberation, and you would deserve it. That, ultimately, is what this conflict is about. Thank you.
Professor Dershowitz.
The present situation is not okay. We do need two states living side by side. I favored two states in 1948 when the Palestinians opposed it. I favored two states in 1967 when the Palestinians opposed it. I favored two states in the year 2000 when the Palestinians opposed it. 1948, the invasion of Israel was a bad act done by bad people. The war of 1967 against Israel was a bad and illegal act done by bad people. When a poster in Cairo showed Arab soldiers shooting, crushing, and dismembering bearded, hook-nosed Jews, and when Nasser said, if war comes, it will be total, and the objective will be Israel's destruction, that was bad, and we have to recognize that. We have to recognize why Israel fears a return of that badness, why Israel fears a genocidal acts against it, if ever there were enough power by the Arabs to destroy Israel. Does anybody in this room doubt that if there were ever a Palestinian or an Arab leader anywhere in the Middle East who had the physical capacity to destroy Israel and forbore from doing so, that that man would be removed from office? Absolutely, that's the case. That is the case, and Israel knows that and must defend itself against that. Yes, there's been ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing was the goal of the 1948 war, to rid the Middle East of the Jewish state. Yes, there's been apartheid. Between 1948 and 1967, the West Bank was subject to apartheid. Jews were not allowed to pray at the Holy Wall. It's impossible to fully understand this conflict without accepting the reality from the very beginning. The Arab strategy has been to eliminate the existence of any Jewish state in Palestine. Maybe that's changed. Maybe it has. Let's test it. Let's test it by asking the what-if question. What if Israel were to do what I think it should do and accede to every one of the demands currently being made by the international community and the most vociferous supporters of the Palestinian statehood, including everything that Ambassador Rahman asks for: statehood on all the land captured during the '67 defensive war, return of a compensation of the refugees, end of the settlements, etc. And as the result of these concessions, Palestinian terrorism were to increase rather than decrease. What if? What would the world community then expect Israel to do in order to protect its civilian population against terrorism directed or permitted by a Palestinian state? Would reoccupation be permitted? Would bombings be permitted? Would Israel be expected to simply accept that status quo? Israel sheds tears, it cries for the situation of the Palestinians. The Palestinians' plight and the Palestinian situation has been caused by the Palestinian leadership and by the Arab leadership. which has used the Palestinian as pawns. And the time has come to recognize this. I hope there will be peace. But peace for Israel cannot be built on weakness, because weakness is the course to genocide. The Jews learned that in the 1930s and the 1940s. The Jews learned that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem would go to Hungary and try and succeed in sending tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews to the gas chambers. The Jews have learned lessons in the past, and they must build their lives on those lessons. Yes, peace. Yes, a two-state solution. But what if? What if it simply weakens Israel and causes greater terrorism? That's the solution. That's the answer that Mr. Ambassador Rahman must respond to. He must tell the Israeli population how they can make peace without it being a first step to genocide. And unless and until that question is answered, put the finger of responsibility precisely where it belongs, on Arab leaders who for the last 75 years have advocated, and many continue to advocate, the destruction of the State of Israel. I wish I could be more optimistic here tonight, but realism is more important than false optimism.
Thank you, Professor Dershowitz. Ambassador Abdurrahman.
You know, Benito Juarez, the great Mexican leader, used to say that paz es el respeto al derecho ajeno. Peace is the respect of the rights of others. When you do not respect the rights of others, you cannot expect peace. The Palestinian people, whose life and their society was dismembered in 1948, who were expelled to become refugees in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, whose towns and villages were demolished, in 1993 came back and they said, for the sake of reconciliation, for the sake of peace for future generations of Palestinians and Israelis, we accept 1/4 of what was ours in exchange for peace. We accept a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza. You know, I wish I could argue those issues as an academic person, because for me it is an existential issue. For me as a Palestinian, it affected every aspect of my life. And therefore I cannot speak of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict devoid of emotions. 29 years of my life I spent in exile. I could not return to my village where I was born. Both my parents died while I'm in exile, and I could not attend their funerals. I have 60 nephews and nieces that I never met until 1993. So for me, this is not an issue that I debate as an academic issue. For me, this is an issue that affects every aspect of my life, my family, my brothers, my sisters, my children. And therefore, I realize also that there are two peoples living in the land of Palestine. Regardless of how we get there, how the Israelis get there. And I have dedicated my life since 1975, when no one even spoke of two-state solution. I am on record, gave an interview to Soho Weekly, which does not exist anymore, in 1975, calling for the two-state solution. So I'm serious about the two-state solution. And this school of thought among the Palestinians, we were able to lead the Palestinians into becoming and accepting the two-state solution. It was not easy, I assure you, because it is hard for someone who was born in Haifa or Jaffa or Akka to forget Haifa, Jaffa, and Akka. But we were able to have a Palestinian consensus to accept this solution. I'm glad that there are people in Israel who share this view with us. General Amiram Mitznah, who is now leading the Labour Party, people like Yossi Beilin, who is today sitting with other Palestinians in London, drafting a plan for negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. I must tell you, my friends, I'm very, very happy that Mr. Dershowitz is at Harvard and not negotiating with us in Jerusalem.
Our final speaker of the evening, aside from some concluding comments from Arash, Rabbi Boutte.
Firstly, it's been an honor to have addressed so august a body as the Harvard Business School. It's the second time I've been back in 6 months. I wasn't accepted, so I'm doing everything to come back. It's been an honor to be on the same platform as one of America's greatest lawyers, Alan Dershowitz, as well as Ambassador Rahman and Dr. Ibish. And let me just say that I have the special and unique pleasure of every morning hosting a radio show, besides this afternoon show I do, for 4 hours every morning on the largest black-owned radio station in New York City. I have an African-American co-host, very respected journalist. And the reason why we can get along amidst having such vociferous disagreements is I get along far better with people who are proud of their identity than people who aren't. And what I've always seen among Muslims in general, and Arabs in particular, is such a fiercely proud identity. Could you imagine if the ferocity with which the Arabs have combated Israel could be inverted and actually was channeled into developing the Arab world? Could you imagine if this canard and this lie, that Israel is the source of all Arab evil, and I have to tell you, and all Arab problems, and I have to tell you that I debated in Oxford, where I was the rabbi. I went back 2 months ago. A very fine man. He's the editor of the Al-Quds newspaper, largest Arab daily outside the Middle East, Abdul Bari Al-Atwan. And he said openly, and I challenged him this because I couldn't believe he said it, that Saddam Hussein is because of Israel. You have to begin to end the canard and the lie that it's all Israel's fault, because I'm telling you, the one thing that we can resolve tonight, we haven't resolved the Arab-Israeli conflict. But even if Israel never existed, this is what would happen. God forbid, if Israel's destroyed, pushed into the sea, the world Jewish community is still going to be okay, thank God. They're well-educated, they're prosperous, they're closely knit, they love their faith. Even without Israel, where will the Arabs be? They'll still be in 22 despotisms, tyrannies. They will still have women who have no human rights. Don't you get it that this is a lie? That this ferocious opposition to Israel has been used to impede Arab progress? Doesn't anyone get this? I'm on a book tour right now, and by the way, let me plug the books because I have them. And I'm doing anything to get rid of them, I promise you. And I'm on a book tour, and I'm driven back by this guy, and I'm speaking to my wife about whether I should get a flu shot. And suddenly the driver says, no, you shouldn't. And he starts telling me all this medical stuff. I said, how do you know this? He said, I'm a Pakistani doctor. And I was going to get my credentials after September 11th. They won't give them to me. That men like him have been so maligned by militant Islam, innocent people. Why do you think, those of you who are circulating a petition here at Harvard, how do you think you're helping anyone by doing that instead of taking your religion back, taking your identity back and channeling it into something positive? Save the Arab world. You might even, if you stop this ferocious opposition, you might even regain the glorious era when Islam was on top of the world instead of on the bottom of the world. Mark Twain wrote in 1867 that he found Palestine, a desolate country, whose soil is rich enough, but is given over wholly to weeds, a silent, mournful expanse. A desolation is here that not even imagination can grace with the pomp of life. We never saw a human being on the whole route. There is hardly a tree or shrub anywhere. Today, Israel, because it's not channeled through hatred, is a vibrant democracy with 5-star hotels, a thriving economy. That's what a Palestinian entity could be. That's what Iraq could be. That's what Egypt could be. Egypt was the same financial condition as South Korea in 1945. Today, it's 5 times poorer. Stop the hatred. Turn back to your roots. You have a beautiful tradition. You have the most incredible religion and faith. Recapture it. Learn to love again instead of making the destruction of Israel the bane of your existence. Because on the day that you do,
you will have learned something from the Jews. Because on this day of Hanukkah, although they had a great military victory, excuse me, sir, I did not interrupt you once this evening. Sir, I did not interrupt you even once this evening.
Ambassador, please.
Because you will have learned one thing from the Jewish religion, that on this day that we had a phenomenal military victory against the Seleucid Greeks. We never decided to erect a triumphal military arch. You won't find any in ancient Israel. We decided to light candles instead.
Please join me in giving a warm hand of applause to our panel this evening. I invite you in closing to think about two peoples, the Jews and the Palestinians, locked in, I think, a tragic situation. Both ancient peoples, both cultured peoples, with great histories of education, proud traditions, and enormous suffering. Each locked in a conflict that it believes, each side believes, represents fundamental issues of existence and survival. That's what we're hearing about tonight. And I think even if we can just go the step of understanding that, it's a small step, but it's probably a necessary step. It's been a privilege, gentlemen, to moderate your discussions tonight. I've endeavored to stay in the middle of the road, but as George Shultz once put it, he who tries to drive down the middle of the road usually gets hit on both sides. But thank you. I'd like to turn things over at this point to Arash for some final comments. And good night.
Let me try to conclude very quickly. When Michael first came up here, there was a number of people we forgot to thank. First, I want to thank Michael himself for agreeing to moderate our debate. It was Michael is an eminent professor here at Harvard of negotiation, so it was very fitting, and given his knowledge of the Middle East, that he should moderate here tonight. So I want to thank him once again. I also want to thank a lot of the staff here at Harvard Business School, without whose support and guidance we could not have achieved what we did tonight. I kind of feel like an Oscar speech, because I'm probably going to forget a few names, but let me try to rattle off a few really quickly. Eileen Tuomi sitting here tonight, Kelly Diamond in the back, Anne-Marie Henke in audiovisual, everyone in operations, Renee Kazada. I also want to thank HBS Media. I hope they're still here, but Jim Eisner, David Lampe, Catherine Walsh, Maura Byrne, and I also want to thank our security staff here tonight. You guys also did a great job. So thank you, everyone, for your support. I also want to echo what Michael said and really thank our panelists who trekked through the bitter cold here tonight and made it here to the Harvard campus. Both clubs are very grateful for your time and consideration. Tonight we sought to explore a very pervasive conflict, which increasingly seems to have no end, no one enemy, and no particular boundaries. The significance of this event was that so future leaders from Harvard and other schools in the area can begin to grapple with tough issues today as students and not let them fester and develop into even larger problems tomorrow. Harvard is comprised of so many nationalities that individual issues will inevitably arise. As an institution of higher learning, however, it is incumbent upon us to educate ourselves, respect our colleagues, and attempt to reconcile our view of the world with those of our neighbors, however hard or that task may ultimately prove to be. Although we covered a lot of ground tonight, I'm hopeful that we've emerged stronger as a community and grown closer as an institution. I've always been inspired by great orators, and remember an inspirational quote by one of my favorite, JFK. Kennedy said, "I am certain that after the dust of centuries has passed over our cities, we too will be remembered not for victories or defeats in battle or in politics, but for our contributions to the human spirit." I urge you tonight to keep this idea in mind and to always strive to make contributions for the betterment of your society. Thank you for coming. Two quick announcements. Some of our speakers have books here. They're going to sign books if you'd like to come, ask questions, or pick up a book. And thank you again for coming.